Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you this conversation about this wonderful new book, Yiddish and Israel, A History. And we have Rachel Rojanski here, who's a wonderful scholar, wrote this book. She's going to be presenting on it. And then we're very lucky to have Rachel Brenner, Sunny Yudkoff, and Shachar Pinsker to join us for a conversation about it. So I'm going to hand it over to Rachel Rojanski, and she's going to present. But before I do, I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us. Of course, we wish we were in person, sharing book talks and lectures and all sorts of things that we do at YIVO. But we're making the most of this situation, and we are actually doing a lot of things like this. So if you are curious to engage more, to learn about Jewish history, Jewish culture, please find us on our website, yivo.org, come to our social media channels. We have recordings of a lot of events, and we have a lot of these kind of things happening live as well. So please do come back. And now I'll go ahead and introduce Rachel Rojanski. Rachel Rojanski is Associate Professor of Judaic Studies at Brown University. She is author of Conflicting Identities, Labor Zionism in North America, 1905 to 1931, as well as many articles on political and cultural history of East European Jewish immigrants in the US and in Israel. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for organizing this event, and thank you, Rachel, Shachar, and Sunny for participating. I am really excited and looking forward to hearing your responses, and thank you all the people who are watching us now. So I will say a few words about my book. I'll present my book. I'll tell you what are the main ideas, the main themes. So the point of departure of my book is the commonly held view that Yiddish was suppressed, even banned and persecuted by the Israeli authorities during the first decades of the state for ideological reasons. Even in the 21st century, Ben-Gurion's one-off description of Yiddish as a foreign and grating language has been used by many as an ultimate proof of the direct link between Zionist ideology of negating of the diaspora and the poor state of Yiddish in Israel. So my book challenges these views and offers instead a new interpretation of the interaction between Yiddish and Israeli Hebrew culture. It is based on rich archival and other sources, newspapers, literature, interviews. So the book unfolds the broad history of Yiddish in Israel from 1948 to the beginning of the 21st century. It not only paints a picture of Yiddish as a vibrant culture in Israel's first decade, but also presents Yiddish as an integral part of the new Israeli culture that developed in those years. So the background for this is the unique situation of the language in the nascent state of Israel. Mass immigration that followed the proclamation of the state meant that Israel's immigrant population outnumbered those already settled. This was an unprecedented situation that obviously created difficulties in terms of housing and jobs, but also brought with it a great number of different languages, Jewish and non-Jewish. Now, making Hebrew the language of the country common to all its citizens became, of course, a central practical need. But there was also an ideological aspect, as Hebrew, as we all know, was the crowning jewel of the Zionist ideology. So no wonder then that the Israeli authorities looked for creative ways to teach Hebrew and instill it among the new immigrants, including restricting the use of non-Hebrew Jewish languages. Now, among those languages, Yiddish had a unique status. Since many of the Israeli leaders came from Eastern Europe, they were aware that Yiddish had been the strongest Jewish language before the Holocaust, and some did see it as a potential obstacle for the inculcation of Hebrew. But at the same time, many had a soft spot for Yiddish and even loved it. This need to negotiate between the practical and ideological considerations on the one hand, and the emotional attachment on the other, led to the development of a dialectic attitude to Yiddish that included love and misgiving, acceptance and rejection at the same time. So the book raises two big questions. One, was there in fact a clearly defined official policy toward Yiddish in Israel? And two, what were the most important influences that shaped the development of Yiddish in Israel? Were these the actions of the state, or did other factors come into play? So the answer to these questions are clustered around three major issues that form the thread that connects all the 7 chapters of the book. So the first one is the development and nature of the cultural hegemony in the state of Israel. The second is the problems arising from the tension between the trans-regional nature of Yiddish and the local nature of the Israeli Hebrew culture. And the third are attitudes towards the past, such as nostalgia, the creation of usable past, and the tension between individual and collective memory. So there is no doubt that the press has always been the heart of modern Yiddish culture. And also, minority press has always been a major player in most immigrant societies. No wonder then that in Israel, the Yiddish press became the first and central arena for the conflict between Yiddish speakers and the state. Based on existing laws of press censorship, the Israeli authorities banned the publication of foreign language dailies, including those in Yiddish. However, it became clear that when it became clear that Yiddish newspapers were circumventing the ban by publishing a daily under 2 titles and bringing it up in alternate days, the authorities simply ignored it. Beyond that, the major political parties themselves published Yiddish newspapers in effort to reach out to the Yiddish readership and to gain their political support. This culminated in 1960 with Mapai, the hegemonic Labor Party, actually purchasing the main Yiddish newspaper, Let's Tenayes, and publishing it for the next 3 decades. So when forced to choose between cultural hegemony and strengthening their political hegemony, the Israeli authorities preferred the latter. The result was that those same forces that wanted to restrict the publishing of the Yiddish newspapers actually contributed to the development of a vibrant Yiddish press. Another popular and important realm of Yiddish culture was the theater, and its development in Israel during the early years reflected the tension that grew up between Hebrew as a local culture and Yiddish as a trans-regional culture. Yiddish theater in early years, like the Yiddish press, struggled with a series of limitations that were, like the case of the press, based on existing licensing laws. However, in early 1951, in the wake of a petition to the High Court of Justice, all the limitations on Yiddish theater were lifted. As a result, popular performances, shund, as we call it in Yiddish, flourished. And though they were mocked and despised by both Hebrew and Yiddish press, they proved the big box office success. Yiddish repertory theater, however, did not prove attractive to the Israeli audience, and so didn't survive. However, though the Israeli leadership was indeed preoccupied with strengthening Hebrew culture, it was also very much investing a great deal of thought in how to establish Israel as a cultural center of world Jewry. In that effort, Yiddish, the quintessential trans-regional Jewish culture, actually played a key role. Government officials, therefore, invested effort in welcoming visiting Yiddish actors, stars with international reputations, who came to Israel for tours. Beyond that, they also tried to convince them to stay, even offering them help in establishing Israeli theater that would help make Israel the center of Jewish culture for the entire Jewish world. Incidentally, this was the same reason that the Histadrut brought the eminent poet Avrom Sutzkever to Israel in 1947 and created for him the Golden Eket, the Yiddish literary quarterly, that actually did make Israel during the 1960s as the center, as the world center for Yiddish literature. That, of course, raises an important question. If the reality was one of an Israeli leadership torn between its ideology and its political interests, between its commitment to Hebrew and its fondness for Yiddish, as a result of which a vibrant Yiddish culture developed in Israel, where did the bitterness toward the state of Israel and its early leaders with which I started come from? So one source, of course, is the expectations of Yiddish speakers, writers and actors who came to Israel after the Holocaust, that they would be welcome as people returning home. In truth, they didn't expect Yiddish to become the language of the state of Israel. Most of them even didn't teach it to the children. They supported Zionism and even Hebrew, but unlike the Israeli leadership, they didn't see the life in Israel as severed from the diasporic past, but rather as its continuation. The best expression for this perception can be seen in the literature that was written in Israel in the 1950s by young writers who created the literary group Young Israel. They wanted their culture to be venerated and were very hurt when it was not. As time went on, the Yiddish-speaking immigrants naturally moved to Hebrew and abandoned the Yiddish press and the Yiddish theater. The 1961 Eichmann Trial brought with it a wave of nostalgia, and which did support a short revival of Yiddish theater with the performance of Die Megillah by Itzik Manger. But it wasn't followed by a real development of Yiddish in Israel. The real comeback of Yiddish theater and the emerging new interest in Yiddish and Yiddish literature belongs to the cultural settings of the late 20th century, with a retreat from the ideology of the melting pot and the development of the politics of identity as the entrance of the third generation to Yiddish cultural scene. Natural processes of social and cultural development prove then once again as a stronger factor in the history of Yiddish than administrative and restrictive measures. Thank
you. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me, Rachel? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Well, so I hope other people hear me too. And I want to tell you, I'm delighted to be here. And I'm very grateful to Rachel for inviting me. I am not an Yiddishist, and I'm not even a historian, but I know the subject from my personal experience. And that's why I appreciate Rachel's contribution to this particular scholarship, but also to scholarship in general. And I'll explain what I mean. As far as I remember, and I was educated in Chinuch Mamlachti Dati, Chinuch Mamlachti Lo Dati, Yiddish was not very well considered in those areas, and Rachel will agree with me. Even history, Jewish, we had two kinds of history. One was general, Historia Klalit, the general history, and one was Historia Am Israel. And the hierarchy was clear. Everybody preferred the former one rather than the later one, which was considered very boring and weak, and all the stereotypes that were piled on the Jewish life, which was defined by this, which was defined by this motto, rejection, negation of the diaspora. So I am representing this kind of ideology. But what is Rachel's particular contribution to scholarship in general is that she, can you just forgive me for 1 second? Hello? I am on webinar. Well, these are the pleasures of working from home. But what I am particularly grateful is that you complicate this issue. Life is not like that. Life is not black and white. Life is gray, hopefully with some shadows of yellow, sunshine, and so on. And what you did here is to take something that was so ideologically entrenched and to complicate it in such a welcoming manner. I mean, there's no jargon here. Everything is clear, is clearly explained what happened. And I think that this is a contribution to scholarship. This is real scholarship. So let me just summarize very quickly, just repeat in a sense what you did, the complication that emerges between the dialectic of the ideology and the personal, the emotional. I think these are the two poles that you deal with, and you contrast them and you show how they work in this particular situation. So you cover, I'm not going to repeat that because you cover the major aspects of Yiddish in Israel, which is the Yiddish press, with this major figure that you described so wonderfully, Mordechai Zamid. I mean, he was a character. All of them were characters, all of them. I really enjoyed reading about them. Then you cover Yiddish theater, which is major figures, and even I remember Ida Kaminska coming to Israel, you know, and she was this was really a great event, but also Jigan and Schumacher and the Birthday family. Then you go into the academia and you cover and you talk about the golden chain. I don't know Yiddish, so I'm not risking going there, but the golden chain, which was you know, inspired by Sutzkover, who's, you know, we just discussed with Sunny at one point, Sutzkover, and a great poet and a great hero, and the chair, Dov Sadan, that you mentioned, which is a very important development. And finally, you talk about the young Israel, the writers who try to introduce the aspect of the Jewish life before into the Israeli reality. So what are the contrasting attitudes? Let me just very briefly summarize. So you have, on the one hand, so you have the dialectic between the ideological struggle for the dominance of Hebrew versus the political interest, and you mentioned it, the political interest in Yiddish-speaking voters. So here we have ideology that is not so well serving the political interest. Another note that I think that we need to emphasize here, that you so clearly explained, is the ideological struggle between the Hebrew-speaking theater, okay, that wanted to have their own audience, and at the same time the desire of the state to become a center of the Jewish theater. So here we have the dialectic of these two kind opposite interests that we have. And then we have the literature, which is my topic, Israeli literature, which wants to be born from the sea as we know that Shamir, you mentioned it, that Shamir is talking about it, and at the same time, the tremendous, tremendous tradition that was lost in the Holocaust. So we have here this this really dialectic, play, and that's why this book is so interesting, because it really shows life and difficult and difficult subject to deal with. And now, today you're talking about the Yiddish interest that is in the Beit Shalom, Shalom Aleichem, and Levi. Okay, so I want to end my presentation with my input, a little bit of input as a literature person, because you treated your discipline is history, and you cover everything. I mean, I don't think there was one a newspaper or one source that you haven't covered, and this is really amazing. I am a literature person, and I want to mention two kind of build on what you've done and mention two things that may deal rather with the emotion, with the psychological aspect of language. So one of them is, one of them is what I found in this book. This is a book by pioneering women, edited by Hadassah, and which lists articles. It was first published in Yiddish, and then it was translated into English, and finally it was translated into Hebrew. So this is the English edition, the new edition that Hadassah put out. And in this volume, there is, and I recommend it to everybody because it's a beautiful piece of writing. And this is the article that written by Rachel Katzenelson. One second. Okay. Rachel Katzenelson Shachar, 1918. So it's very early. The article is called From Language to Language. It turns out, and I didn't know it either, that the Zionists, the pioneering Zionists, and here were women, these are all women, first started with Russian, because that's what they knew. Then they moved to Yiddish. In the settlement, in the Yishuv, they used to move it. And finally, they moved into Hebrew. And this is a piece of wonderful psycho-linguistic, exploration of how our minds work. So let me just read the final piece that she's doing. So I hope it will whet your taste, your appetite for reading the whole article, which is really wonderful. It's really wonderful. So let me just read that. Yiddish was the language of the folk, of democracy. But in Yiddish literature, there reigned narrowness, inertia, and, as seen by our generation, the spirit of reaction. The stream of thought that meant revolution for us found its expression in Hebrew literature. And every person of living thought, and this is truest for the children of our generation, our people and our situation, feels himself drawn towards the sources of revolution. So I am connecting with what you said throughout your talk about, the conflict or the dialectic between the Hebrew and the Yiddish, but she shows it was not that simple to leave this Yiddish. And I want to conclude with a book that you mentioned, and this is the book of Meget. Okay, so Meget wrote the Feugelman that you mentioned in your book. I worked on Feugelman millions of times ago, but you reminded me of him. So here we are. So I would think that if we have two bookmarks or two posts, one is Rachel Katzenelson, and the other is this supposedly Sabra. Well, he was not Sabra. He came when he was 5 years old, but he really was everywhere in the Yishuv. He did everything. And he writes this Feugelman about a poet who wants to introduce exactly what you were talking about, wants to introduce Yiddish into the gestalt of Israel, and he fails. But what Aharon Meged does is the failure of Feugelman, and he takes the psychoanalytical approach. What Feugelman's failure really represents is the failure of Israel as well. The person, the protagonist who wants to encourage him and who is really attracted to him so much is an Israeli historian of Zionism. His life falls apart. His life falls apart. The failure of Feugelman really destroys the Hebrew myth that he built. The book ends with a young student who is engaging in writing on two movements that were established in the same year, 1897. Now, one is Zionist, Herzl, and the other is Medem, who established the Bund. So what Meged is trying to do, to find some synthesis between the two languages, the two cultures, okay? And here we are talking about a perfect sabra. I mean, there couldn't be a more perfect sabra than Meged was trying to play. So I just want to thank you. This is a wonderful book, and it's a true scholarship, and I'm sure that people will really learn from it about Israel from a different perspective than we usually do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Rachel, before we move on, could you show the cover of that book? A lot of people missed it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, please.
You ask me what Rachel?
Rachel Brenner, because
okay.
the one that she read.
The one.
Yeah. Can you show it a little higher? Yeah. Can you read it out loud for us?
Yes. It calls The Plow Woman, and it is records of the pioneer women of Palestine.
Wonderful, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's what we're here for. Learn about books.
Okay, so it's my turn now?
No, I think that's Sunny, and then you will conclude this the way I remember it. Sunny?
Who's going first? Shall I go first?
Shachar, why don't you go first?
Okay. So, okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you to Rachel and to Alex for inviting me. I'm very happy to participate here in this wonderful panel on this wonderful book, Yiddish and Israel, a history. And, you know, both of you mentioned the personal dimension, so I might as well start with that. There's actually a double personal connection. One is that I became very interested in this topic about 10 years ago, and I met Rachel in Tel Aviv, and we organized a conference together in a double conference, one in Haifa University and one in Ann Arbor, and that began a dialogue that continued many, many years, and you know, this book is one product of it, and hopefully there'll be many more. The other one, since both of you mentioned the issue of the generations, you know, I'm really maybe representing here the third generation of somebody who studied Yiddish as a foreign language at YIVO in New York City, but in fact I heard a lot of Yiddish at home from my grandparents and my parents. I mean, I wouldn't be born in Israel unless my grandmother in Warsaw, who was born into a Hasidic family, Ger Hasidim, read a poem in Yiddish about Tel Aviv and said, wow, I have to go and visit this place. And, you know, her father didn't want her to go there, but she did. She insisted on going. And that's how my father was born, and that's how I was born. So I think many of us have these personal connections, and some of them are inside the scholarship, and some of them are outside the scholarship. And I'm sure all of us can tell all kinds of stories about these personal elements. I want to to join what Rachel Brenner said and agree with her that really Rachel did a wonderful job in this book, which is so difficult because it's a topic that really requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of work of finding all these different sources, both what was published and printed, and a lot of archival materials, which Rachel did so well. But it's also a topic that really requires very close analysis, because it's very easy to go to one extreme or the other and just say, the rejection of Yiddish or the love of Yiddish or one way or another. And the analysis here is really essential, and it shows us how really how dialectical and complex and nuanced the picture is. So Rachel wrote in the introduction to the book on page 17, the full history of Yiddish language and culture in the state of Israel, and especially the nexus of the development of Yiddish with that of Israel's Hebrew culture, is yet to be told. And I totally agree with it. Until a few years ago, when people asked about Yiddish in Israel, I think many people assumed, well, what there is to study or what there is to say about it. There isn't really much. The height of Yiddish culture was between the middle of the 19th century and the Holocaust, and then it's really a story of decline. We mentioned Avram Sutzkever a few times, and many people refer to him as the last great Yiddish poet, right? But the truth is that what many of us, and Rachel has been leading this trend, is showing is that there's actually a lot more that needs to be studied. And maybe, since I am also like Sunny and like Rachel Brenner, a literary scholar, I want to focus mostly on the literary side of things. But, I'm thinking here about Sutzkever just as one very prominent example. What if we think of Sutzkever not as the last great Yiddish poet, but as the first great Yiddish Israeli poet, one who really fostered, as Rachel is showing, a lot of creativity of younger people who continue to create in Yiddish. So I think really one thing that I took from Rachel's book is the fact that we really need to understand the connection between Israel and Yiddish culture, and we can't seriously understand Yiddish culture, especially after the Holocaust, without taking into consideration what was created in Israel. You can't just look at what's going on in New York or in Canada or even in Australia and in Europe without taking into consideration what was going on in Israel, and not just Sutzkever and the Golden Age, right, which was definitely very central. So that's on one hand, but then at the same time, you cannot understand Israeli culture without taking into consideration what was created in Yiddish. And that's maybe the surprising part, aspect, because again, as both of you said, normally when we think about Israel, we think about the conflict we think about Israel and its Arab neighbors, and we don't really think about Yiddish as something that is so central to Israeli culture. So this is the main point that I took out of the book, and again, you really need to see the nuances, and you have to read the book chapter by chapter to see the analysis that Rachel is doing with the press, with the theater, with literature, and with other elements. I want just to mention before I let Sunny speak, just focusing on literature again. A few important figures which Rachel is discussing, but I think there's so much more for us to study and to analyze. There is a there's a huge amount of literature and other cultural products, the film and artwork that was created in Israel. A lot of it is about Europe, it is about what was going on in the Holocaust, but a lot of it is about Israeli life and the connection between life in Israel and the diasporic transnational Jewish culture. And I'm thinking here about certain figures. You mentioned Young Israel, so I'm thinking about people like Yosel Birstein, I'm thinking about people like Mendan, Rivka Bassman, Hey Binyamin Arushovsky, Harshav, and I'm thinking here about the and what I'm mostly interested here is the role of certain people who were mediating in between the Hebrew culture or what was known as, kind of what is familiar to us as, Israeli culture. We think about Israeli poetry. Of course, we don't really think about the poems of, or we didn't used to think about the poems of Sutzkever and Rivka Bassman and so many other great poets, but we think about Yehuda Amichai and Natan Zach, right? Or we think about Moshe Shamir, who was already mentioned, and Aaron Meged, right? And other people, but some of these figures seem to be like Yosel Birstein, like Hey Binyamin, seem to be marginal, right? But they were also an important role of mediating, right? Mediating between the world of Yiddish through translation, through their connections, right? And we mentioned, or I think Rachel mentioned, or it's in the book, about the connection between a group like Young Israel, which didn't exist for many years. It didn't seem to be so important in Israeli culture, but really the connection between them and the group of Likrat, where Zach and Amichai and so many others, you can't really understand it without the mediating role of people like Hey Binyamin, who participated in both and brought the innovation of Yiddish literature from America and from Eastern Europe into Israel. So many of these links and these influences were actually not acknowledged. They were submerged. They were hidden. They were not even acknowledged in even after many, many years. And I'm thinking here also about people like Aaron Appelfeld, who actually began his career as a student of Dov Sadan of Yiddish literature, and wrote both in Hebrew and in Yiddish, and even presented himself as a Hebrew-Yiddish bilingual writer, and then very quickly switched to Hebrew and made a name for himself as maybe the most important Holocaust writer in Hebrew. But really his way of discovering Hebrew was through Yiddish, and is knowing the Yiddish Israeli milieu, people like Leib Brochman and other writers, was really, really important for him. And that's even true for younger people like Yaakov Shabtai, who did not speak Yiddish, but grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home, and then later on translated Sholem Aleichem and Itzik Manger and many others for the theater in Hebrew, right? So the role of these mediating characters also, I don't want to speak just about literature, but also think about art. People like Yosel Bergner, right? We mentioned Yosel Birstein, but Yosel Bergner, the artist, who became hugely popular in Israel, was also one of these mediating characters. And it's really important both for the literature and for the theater as well, the role of these mediating figures. I just want to end with thinking about something that Rachel is touching on her book, and I'm very interested in now, which is what happens, how do we understand Israeli culture in a different way if we take seriously what was created in Yiddish or even in Hebrew, but influenced by Yiddish. And I just want to give one specific example, and I'll end with that. 1948, right? The war of 1948 that is really the foundational event in Israel, and so many people wrote about it and reflect on it. Many of these people who came as Holocaust survivors and Sheir Sapleta, right, as plitim, as refugees, some of the young people were brought from Europe, from DP camps and fought in the war. Some of them who were older did not fight in the war, but because there was there was a very difficult situation, people were put in transit camps and in abandoned houses of Palestinians, and they wrote about it. Now, in Yiddish. Now, people wrote about these experiences in Hebrew as well, but the people who wrote about it in Yiddish did it in a different way. And I became very interested recently in how they wrote about it. Now, it doesn't mean that they were anti-establishment or subversive, but they wrote about it from the point of view of people who experienced what was going on in Europe in the Holocaust and their experience of being refugees, and their kind of empathy with the others, even if it's an other that they don't understand, that they don't know very well, they can communicate because they don't know Arabic, but this kind of traumatic experience influenced the way they depicted the Israeli, the experience of 1948, and what was it like to live in Israel in the 50s and early 60s, right? In a way that is both central to understanding Israeli culture, but also very different from the usual way that we are thinking about 1948. So this is really just a small example, and also something that I think many of us using Rachel's book can use to study more and to write more, because I think that this is really just the beginning. It's such a rich topic that people didn't take into consideration until now, and I think that from now on there's going to be a lot more work done. Okay.
Sunny, this is your turn now.
Okay. So let me start by thanking you, Rachel Rojanski, and forgive me, I'm going to use Rojanski just for clarity's purpose when I continue speaking. Rachel Brenner, my colleague, and Shachar Pinsker for sharing their thoughts and research today, as well as to Alex Weiser-Yibo for facilitating. I'm looking forward to the discussion that will follow. And I see that the hard part for me about going third in a book response panel is that I don't want to be repetitive. But if you'll indulge me, I know that from teaching, repetition is key. So I'd like to start by briefly summarizing Rojanski's work to set the frame for my comments. And what Rojanski's recent publication, Yiddish and Israel, through my reading does is work that lowers the pitch. So what do I mean by that? When I teach Yiddish literature, I usually offer 5 reasons for the decline of Yiddish in the 20th century as a vernacular language. The first is the Holocaust and the decimation of the largest population bloc that spoke the language. The second is the suppression of Yiddish cultural expression in the Soviet Union after a period of flourishing. The third is the cultural pressures of linguistic assimilation in America and other areas where the descendants of Yiddish speakers found themselves. The fourth is the suppression of Yiddish in Palestine and the state of Israel in the name of Hebrew. And the fifth is the long-standing reputation of Yiddish as a non-language or a jargon, something to be evolved beyond. And Rojanski's work focuses in on the fourth and fifth reasons, the suppression of Yiddish in Israel and the negative associations of the language. And she argues that from the late 40s to the late 60s and somewhat in the decades that follow, Yiddish in Israel was, contrary to the received narrative, often supported by the state and its political institution. What ultimately proves perhaps more debilitating for the language in Israel was the cultural reputation that attached to Yiddish in Israel. So to putting this another way, when Yiddish was no longer a threat to the ascendancy of modern Hebrew, politicians at the highest level expressed moderate support for Yiddish cultural production and assigned Israel the role as a self-designated center of global Jewish culture. In Rojanski's words, quote, The status of Yiddish in Israel at that time was not shaped by legislation, but rather by public opinion, end quote. So this is how Rojanski, for me, lowers the pitch of the historiographic record. Her subject is not the overt suppression of Yiddish in Mandate Palestine, which saw, for example, the founding of a group known as Gedud Meginei HaSafa, what Rojanski translates as defenders of the Hebrew language, but rather she turns her attention to historical moments, such as when the dominant political party in the early years of the state, Mapai, chose to publish a Yiddish newspaper to spread their message while never distancing themselves formally from a Hebraist stance. The historiographic argument is field-changing, and Rojanski has patiently and with copious archival documentation that we've all commented upon. I mean, reading through some of the protocols of those meetings, I'm eternally grateful for that, the work that led to this argumentation, along with her textured analysis, demonstrates the state of Israel did not actively, here meaning by law, suppress the Yiddish language or Yiddish culture. Her work reveals a rich intellectual and cultural landscape, from the founding of a Yiddish chair at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, to the establishment of an elite journal of Yiddish literature and culture and society we've heard about now, Die Goldene Kate, under the editorship of poet hero Avram Sutzkever, to the mounting of multiple plays in Yiddish in the 1960s, to the creation of a Yiddish literary group known as Young Israel. But let me return to that quote I mentioned earlier. Rojanski writes, quote, that the status of Yiddish in Israel was not shaped by legislation, but rather by public opinion. And to this, she adds a parenthetical aside, quote, though that was itself influenced to some extent by the attitude of the authorities. To repeat, the status of Yiddish in Israel was not shaped by legislation, but rather by public opinion, parentheses, though that was itself influenced to some extent by the attitude of the authorities. And I want to think more about that term influence. Think here of the official designation of Avraham Levinson, a representative of the Histadrut, the General Federation of Jewish Labor, or what Rachel Rojanski calls the executive arm of the Israeli government in the early years, as Sutzkever's co-editor of Die Goldene Kate. So even if everyone knew that this Yiddish poet hero, Sutzkever, was the man behind the operation, he was not officially allowed to be the sole editor. This is even after, for example, Golda Meir herself facilitated his illegal migration to Palestine. What I'm circling around here, and it betrays my own interest in the work of literature, of how literary traditions are created, how influence works, and also how writers come to write what they do, the power structures. What I'm sensing is in this analysis of influence, in this analysis of power in Rojanski's text, that Rojanski is actually telling a story about how Israeli governmentality works. So the political establishment, as it were, had been so successful at suppressing Yiddish in the Yishuv, right, that it simply did not need to formally legislate against the language after the founding of Israel. To put it a different way, the government no longer had to emphasize anti-Yiddish sentiment because the population had already been disciplined to be against Yiddish, right? The government even could go so far as to support, via the Histadrut, the publication of Die Goldene Kate. And one of the terms Rojanski uses, and I've used it a number of times now, is threat. To paraphrase Rojanski, the Histadrut didn't see the publication of Die Goldene Kate as a threat. But as she writes, they also anticipated that it would get a negative response from the population. And I guess what I want to hear more and think more together, and what this book really urged me to think about methodologically, is how to understand this power dynamic that's right at the center between politics and culture, between the government and the people. Hegemony is a key word for the book, but I wonder if we can really talk about cultural hegemony disentangled from governmental hegemony. Is this a different way? Is this an absence of government restrictions, or is it the success of the government's insistence on Hebrew over and against Yiddish? A history, and here I'm going to use like a little bit of jargon, right? History in which the will of the sovereign doesn't need to be imposed from top down because it's already imposed from the bottom up. At no point, for example, does the Israeli government seem to actively fight against the negative reputation of Yiddish, or go so far as to encourage its use as an official language. These are counter-historical propositions. And to be sure, as Rojanski demonstrates, some government leaders did see themselves as advocates for Yiddish, especially in as much as they saw Israel as the center of global Jewish culture. And other officials began to speak of Yiddish through the lens of stereotype, right? By the 1960s, 1970s, through the haze of nostalgia, alternatingly adoring and condescending, always affectively. And toward the end of the study, Rojanski points out that Yiddish in Israel from the 1960s until today has borne with it a reputation as a language that is funny and tinged with nostalgia, right? A reputation that's very legible in a Jewish American cultural discourse. And she argues that this reputation, in fact, has counterintuitively helped sustain the presence of Yiddish in Israeli society. But again, I want to sort of question this power dynamic. Is this a vision of Yiddish that has been scripted by Hebraist stereotyping? Or is this a form of Yiddish culture that's participating in its own mocking? I don't know, these are just questions I was thinking about when I was reading the final chapters. So to close, Yiddish in Israel is a critical source for any student of modern Yiddish culture and language politics. And I'd be remiss not to note here that my own writing about Avram Sutzker is heavily indebted to Rojanski's work. So the importance of this text is clear. But for me, it's also just raised the important questions of how we navigate these complicated power dynamics of state and culture when it comes to Yiddish, no less when it comes to Yiddish in Israel. So I look forward to discussing this and the questions raised by the other respondents together and hopefully in future years.
Okay, so shall we open the discussion? I don't know where Alex is.
Yes.
Alex?
Yes, I'm right here. Do you want me to come in for questions, or do you want to talk first amongst yourselves before we do that?
Well, you have to tell me how much time we have.
Why don't we talk for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll do questions.
Okay.
Can I just add something in just to comment on something that Sunny raised? I also asked myself this question: the state and the kind of the culture that comes from below, from the people themselves, right? And what was the interchange between that? You know, I mean, you can see Rachel Rojanski in some examples that you brought. There was a little bit of ambiguity there about the policy of the government, or for a short time they didn't want theater production to go, but then they said, oh no, okay, it's fine, let's do it. Or the same thing happened with the press, and it does raise the question of how the people themselves, without the government, without Ben Gurion, without the authorities, how they understood it. And I also want to mention, since Rachel Brenner mentioned Aaron Meged and Feigelman, Meged was a very important figure in the early 50s. As you mentioned, he was not Sabra, he came at the age of 5, but he claimed to not know Yiddish. But already in 1945, when he was the editor of Masa, which was official from Mapai, he wrote an article called Nachala Shchucha, about the inheritance of Yiddish as early as 1948, and he said two contradictory things there in the same article. He said, you know, Yiddish is gone. Yiddish is died together with East European Jews in the Holocaust, and you know, whatever is left is going to die very, very soon, right? Which made all the Yiddishists and all the Yiddish writers mad. He said, what are you talking about? There's so much is going on. But he also said, you know, this is an inheritance for us, for Israel. And the way to do it is to make sure that whatever was created in Yiddish needs to be translated, need to be anthologized, need to be preserved for the creation of Israeli culture, because without it, we're going to be poor. Israeli culture is going to miss something that is so important. And you can see so early in the 1950s, as a young person from the Sabra generation, many of the ideas that later on came in Feigelman in 1987, how he deals with it. So I don't know, I think that for me, it kind of captures both this dialectics and also the question that Sunny asked about what comes from above and what comes from below. And it's really interesting to see all the people who responded by letters and to what Meged was suggesting.
Can I say something, Rachel?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so I want to respond to both to Shachar and Sunny, and to say that actually, as the government didn't create any law or any restriction for Yiddish. All the restrictions came from bureaucrats. And if you're talking about coming from bottom up, there was a huge pressure of the Union of Hebrew journalists to restrict Yiddish in all kinds of creative ways. So, and also they put pressure on members of the Knesset with the goal to pass some laws that would restrict Yiddish, and members of the Knesset didn't cooperate with it. So when you say from bottom up, I would say it came from the public. There were interests here. Now, the other thing that I want to respond is I started the book with Birstein and I ended it with Meged. Right. So, these are the two poles. And then if we talk about Meged, there is an article that he wrote he has a small book of essays, Mishulchan HaKtiva Sheli, from my desk. And then he has an essay about Yiddish. And he says, Yiddish is soft, Yiddish is sweet. When I speak Yiddish, I come home. And also, and there is in one of the chapters there was a discussion about among Yiddish journalists, led especially by the late Yitzhak Luden, who died 2 to 3 years ago, and we knew him very well, and also Mordechai Chalamish. And they were saying, yes, people now love Yiddish like an old woman who should sit, an old grandma who should sit by the fireplace and knit socks and will not interfere in anything that we are doing. And Chalamish said to him, it's our fault. We didn't teach our children, we didn't pass it on. So, and then it gave me the impression that on the one hand, these Yiddish activists, writers, journalists, they didn't pass Yiddish to the next generation, and they didn't like the image of Yiddish as cute, funny. But at the same time, the fact that Yiddish did have this image opened the door to Yiddish for people who had nothing to do with it. And once the door was open, they were inside. So in a way, these public opinions, interests against Yiddish, perceptions of Yiddish, opened the door for the next stage of Yiddish.
I think that we should open the questions, maybe. Alex, are you there?
Yes, sure.
Maybe we should entertain a few questions.
Sure, yeah.
From our faithful audience.
Okay, so from the audience, some questions. Debbie Rothman asks, both English and Arabic are considered national languages of Israel. Why not Yiddish?
It's not true. Can I answer?
Please.
Yeah, no,
okay.
Go for it.
But then, okay. So until the nation, Israel didn't have any law about the national language until during mandatory Palestine. There were 3 official languages in mandatory Palestine, which were, of course, English, Hebrew, and Arabic. Afterwards, Hebrew was the language, the spoken language, the language of the country, and there was no official language. Only recently with the Chok HaLeom, with the nation law, Hebrew became the only official language. So actually there was no official language in Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, Philip Spain. Sorry, is there other comments?
No, maybe Shachar wants to add.
No. That's true. There's a difference between the public sphere and the fact that signs are in all these languages, but this is not a law about national language, and this is another one of those myths. And it's interesting that now, in the last few years, the debate about kind of demoting Arabic and other languages and trying to put Hebrew as the only one. Yeah.
Philip Spain asks, is Western Yiddish also represented in Israel? For those that don't know, Western Yiddish is, when people say Yiddish, they really mean Eastern Yiddish. Western Yiddish is a kind of old dialect that people have not been speaking for a few hundred years, particularly that of Alsace and Switzerland. And what kind of Yiddish predominates in Israel? Lithuanian, Polish? Do we know the answer to that?
You're asking me? Well, I think, I mean, I can tell you something about myself. When I was born in Tel Aviv, and I grew up in what is called now the old north of Tel Aviv, which is the center of Tel Aviv. And you know, when I went out of our apartment to the lobby, it was like a lingual lab of Yiddish dialects. Many, except for the neighbors on the third floor who spoke Arabic, everyone, and the neighbor on the first floor who spoke Hungarian, and she didn't know Yiddish. Everyone was speaking Yiddish in many different languages, in many different dialects, and all the dialects existed, but you know, biology does what it does. And I don't think that there are any more, people don't speak, there are no more native speakers in Yiddish. So the ultra-Orthodox, they speak, you know, the dialect, what we call, I mean, the popular name is the Polish, the Hasidic, and the Lithuanian, what this person who asked, mentioned, is almost not used anymore because the Lithuanian, the Litvak yeshivot, they speak Hebrew. In Israel and in America, they speak English. So actually this, the Lithuanian dialect is actually disappearing, and people speak standard Yiddish, or as I heard once from Shachar, I said, I speak Yivo dialect.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just to add, in terms of writing, people also did not write in Yivo Yiddish. Most of overwhelming majority came from Lithuania and from Poland. So, you know, they were using that dialect. But if you look at the poetry, for example, of Avrom Rintzler and Hey Binyamin, there is a very heightened awareness of the history of Yiddish language, including Western Yiddish. And, you know, they play a lot with that in the early poetry, but even later in poetry.
Even Moshe Leib Halperin does it.
Yeah.
So
are we on time, or what?
We'll go another 10, 15 minutes. I think there's a lot of questions. I don't want to cut it off, if that's okay for everyone.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll go to 5:15, 5:20.
I think 15 minutes.
Okay.
No more than, because I'm sure other people have other things to do too.
Okay, so we won't get to all of the questions, but we'll try to get to a few more. Did Yad Vashem play a role in the history of Yiddish in Israel?
You're asking me?
It's open question. Anyone can answer.
Okay, so it's a complicated question. Not actively. This is my current project on Rachel Auerbach, or Rachel Auerbach, as Rachel Brenner would correct me. She collected lots of testimonies in Yiddish, but also in Polish and in Russian. No, that Yad Vashem was not a player in the place of Yiddish in Israel.
Just add about Rachel Auerbach. She was also the one who established in Yad Vashem the testimonies, department. So there were many testimonies, I'm sure, in Yiddish.
Yes, and also in Polish.
Yes, she herself wrote in Yiddish in Davar, and that's what I read by her, and it was translated into Hebrew. So she was writing in Yiddish. Yes.
She wrote what became a whole book in Land Israel, where her impressions and stories. But yeah, I mean, she was in Yad Vashem, and now looking back, she was very important in Yad Vashem. But as far as I know, Rachel knows much more about that. She was actually marginalized within the Yad Vashem.
She was marginalized because she was too independent.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, maybe we can take another question because.
Yes. Are there parallels to the government's attitude towards the Arabic of Mizrahi Jews in the attitude towards Yiddish? Was that negativity similarly legislated or non-legislated? How is their relationship to Arabic of Mizrahi Jews?
Can I jump in for this for a second, Rachel, if you don't mind? I just will have one comment. I think that that in terms of the way I heard about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the new generation, the second generation, forgot Arabic. There are young second generation immigrants to Israel who did not want to study the language of their parents, the same way as, by the way, the children, immigrant children from the Ashkenazi family. I mean, that's what I know, but maybe Rachel won't.
So, Rachel, what you said is actually it's universal characteristic of immigrant society that the first generation comes with the language and the culture. The second generation turns their back on it, and the third generation comes back. Now, you can't. First of all, you can't compare Arabic to Yiddish because Arabic wasn't a Jewish language. It's the language of the Arab countries, and I mean, it wasn't considered a threat to Hebrew. But there's another thing that needs to be said. That I mentioned it very, I allude to it in my book. It's not the main topic, not the focus. The Ashkenazi East European leaders of the State of Israel didn't think too much about the culture of the Jews who came from the Arab countries, and they didn't think that the culture that they brought with them is a threat for the Israeli new culture. So they more or less ignored it.
There were other considerations there. I totally agree. Maybe we can take some more.
Okay, a sort of related question is other minority Jewish languages like Ladino, does their existence in Israel have a similar story to Yiddish, or how would you compare?
So, okay, so with Ladino, it doesn't have a similar story because it was not, I mean, it didn't attract the attention of the authorities, and it wasn't so dominant in pre-state Israel like Yiddish. What happened to Ladino is that it had good luck in the form of Yitzhak Navon and other figures that pushed it strongly. And toward the end of the 20th century, actually, Yiddish was piggyback on a Ladino to get some official status in Israel because of the power. And Yiddish didn't have at the same time. They didn't have Yitzhak Navon, who was the fifth president of the state and was from a Sephardi family. He didn't have a person like, didn't have other figures to push it in the same way. And actually, the Ladino pulled Yiddish toward the creation of the National Authority of Yiddish Culture and Ladino Culture.
I just want to add here that obviously there are important differences here between Yiddish and Ladino, and also Arabic, which did have a Judeo-Arabic, a special Jewish dialect. So we shouldn't really confuse them and see each one on their own. At the same time, I think that part of what I was trying to talk about at the beginning, there's a kind of new way of understanding Israeliness and what is Israeli culture, not just as what was created in Hebrew, but in all these different languages. And we get a much fuller and more complex picture of Israeli culture when we take these languages into account.
Can I jump in for a second?
Please.
Yeah, okay. I would like, I don't know if you will decide if this is the end, but I would like to emphasize one aspect of Rachel's book that I think needs to be emphasized, and this is the dynamic of the historical development. I mean, she is really doing a wonderful job, and this is not just this is not just a compliment, which of course it is, but it's a meaningful compliment that things don't stay in place. Things change. And one of the examples that she gives, and it's a very correct example. One is, of course, Eichmann Trial, how it transformed. But the other is also the 6-day war, that there was the waiting, and this reminded, and then we have all the personal testimonies of the soldiers, and it was also the October War, so the Yom Kippur War. So I think that what she does is she does a very complicated but a very correct job to show how history doesn't say. We change our attitudes toward Hebrew also as a result of changes in the Hebrew mentality of the state. So I just wanted to add it, and I don't know, it seems to me that maybe we will conclude here, or what?
I'd like to have one final question to end on. What is the role of Yiddish in Israel going forward, especially as Israeli culture changes, as the demographics of Israel change? What role do you think Yiddish may play in that story?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm a historian. I can tell you what happened. I mean, I can't make any prophecy what is going to happen. What I see is that over the last 2 decades, there is, I would say, a new phase in Yiddish culture. We see young people with no Yiddish background stepping in. We have novels that are, the protagonists are Yiddish speakers that are dealing with Yiddish theater, that are describing Yiddish in America. We have, it's Matan Hermoni that wrote Arba Aratzot, which is like style Bashevis Zinger, and it's about a Yiddish writer. And I mean, he plays with Arba Aratzot, which is the four lands, the Council of Four Lands. It's also a name of a street in Tel Aviv, and this is where it happens.
Publishing company.
Yes, yes, Hebrew, of course, Hebrew Publishing Company. And then we have Irmi Pinkus with the satirical cabaret of Professor Fabrikant. And also, going back, there was a very, very nice short movie, which is called Beit Avi, which actually presents this situation of the new immigrant. And the quintessential Israeli, strong, sun-tanned, strong and hardworking. And all of a sudden, it unfolds that the quintessential Israeli is an Auschwitz survivor. So Yiddish is becoming part of the Israeli culture, and there are more initiatives and writings, and Yad Biran with his book, and some more, and the activities of Bet Shalom Alechem and other things. And I think that the future is still to be seen.
Well, that's a wonderful.
I don't have time to talk about it, but I just want to thank Yael Chaver. I saw that she wrote some wonderful comments, and we all, of course, learned from a wonderful book about Yiddish in Palestine.
Yes, Yiddish, yes. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. I'm sorry for all those that we can't get to your questions, but I encourage you to get the book. I'm going to send the link for it in the chat. It's a wonderful book, and there's a lot more to be discussed and to continue to wrestle with. So thank you all so much.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you all.
Rachel, for your book.
Thank you.
Thank you.